My paper is dealing with the seasonal effects on stock markets, and it examines country changes in the stock market depending on seasonality and interest rate movements and the seasonal affective disorder. The motivation behind this paper and what this paper is about is that there has been so much research in the stock market movements and what makes the stock market stick. Of course, there's going to be recessions and there's going to be expansions that are important for the stock market. Stock market is the leading indicator of the macroeconomic activity. But there has been a big body of research discussing how seasonal affective disorder affects the stock market every year. Lots of research led by Kamstra et al., professors from Canada, discussing how seasonal affective disorder does in fact affect the stock market every single year. They examined about 17 countries around the globe with different latitudes, whose stock markets were at different latitudes, and concluded that the seasonal affective disorder, a psychological disorder, does in fact affect the stock market. And the idea behind this is that the seasonal affective disorder in winter, when there's less light, the days are shorter, people get depressed, and they get seasonally depressed, and they have less willingness to do different activities, including the stock market. So their hypothesis, which they confirmed, was such that in the fall, stock market returns would fall because there would be little interest from market participants, or less interest from market participants, and then the stock market returns would increase throughout winter. That phenomenon has been observed, that the stock market's returns are in fact seasonally higher in winter. And in fact, that has led to some colloquial sayings that, invest in winter and then just take your money away and wait for the next winter. But I thought that there was something more to it, that there was macroeconomic reasons behind that stock market activity and the observed seasonality in the stock market. So I replicated the Kamstra study and also added my own variables to it to see whether there's other motivation behind that study. I've also expanded the sample to 34 countries, so I'm looking at emerging economies, and we'll look at the by-country statistics in a minute. So I've expanded the sample to 34 countries, and the data set is between 1973 and 2015, which overlaps with Kamstra. And lo and behold, I did find a strong relationship between interest rates and their seasonal component affecting the stock market. So we do know that there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and asset pricing. And we see this globally right now. As central banks raise interest rates, we see adjustments to the stock market, which tells us how assets are priced. So as interest rates increase, asset pricing and stock markets should go down. What I did is I interacted and regressed interest rates, other macroeconomic variables such as monetary base, industrial production, agricultural activity, along with the seasonal affective disorder variable, to see whether the seasonal affective variable still mattered when I regressed with other variables, as well as whether those macroeconomic variables made sense. So here in this, I gave a long introduction, and basically stock returns and macroeconomic effects. There's a large body of research completely separate from the seasonal affective disorder research. Fama, a Nobel Prize recipient, Justin Roll, James et al., 1985, they all discuss, and then many, many beyond, but these are landmark studies, discuss linkages between stock returns, interest rates, monetary base, and real production, the real addition to the economy. The interest rate seasonality has been studied thoroughly by Diller, Chatterjee, Truman, Cazares, specifically seasonality in the EU, in the US and European Monetary Union, as well as other more developed countries, which can also give us an indication of how developing economies could better use their monetary policies on asset pricing and their stock markets and the stability of the economy. The general idea between interest rate seasonality is a lot of countries and a lot of monetary banks know that there is changes in monetary base and interest rates throughout the year. This is due to industrial production, harvest in August, changes in the amount of money in circulation, and changes in the demand for money in circulation. For instance, around big holidays such as Christmas or the Festival of Light, there is change. There are different demands for money. People celebrate, people buy presents, they gather together, and there is seasonally observed more spending in the economy. So central banks have for decades adjusted interest rates, very subtly and behind the scenes adjusted interest rates, completely separate from the big announcement of interest rates, interest rate movements that we're seeing now, and that has real effects on the stock market as well. Well, the idea is that the expected changes or the smoothing of interest rates should be as such that it would also smooth the stock market, so we wouldn't see these jumps in stock market. This graphic is to show the observance of these changes. So mean seasonal affective disorder, the seasonal affective disorder variable is a dummy. And this follows the big body of research of Kamstra et al. Discussing that seasonality and asset prices is due to seasonal affective disorder. So I'm just using the same variable, and that variable is basically a number of night hours. And this is a dummy if it's 1 in the fall and winter and 0 during summer and spring. And we do see that, well, this is a dummy, so obviously during the fall and spring, and here 0 to 12 is going to be the months of the year. So fall and spring and summer, there's no changes to night hours, but we do see the dummy goes to 1 during fall and spring, fall and winter. Well, if we look at the mean interest rate, MPA is per annum. If we look at the mean interest rate, well, we see a similar pattern. This is the interest rate is a continuous variable, so it's not going to be the same as dummy, but we do see that in winter, the interest rates are high and they do decrease. And those decreases are very small and subtle. They do decrease throughout the year and they go back up. And they go back up in the fall and throughout the winter. And the last visualization is the seasonal component of interest rates. So what I did in the study to see whether the interest rates affect the stock market is I first looked at the interest rates at their face value, but I also decomposed the variable of interest rates into the seasonal component and the seasonally adjusted component. Here we can see that along with the seasonally adjusted component shouldn't have any variation, right? Because it's seasonally adjusted, but the seasonal component, we also see not quite the exact same pattern as the interest rate or SAD, but we also see that decrease in seasonal component of interest rates throughout spring and summer, and then it increases in September and throughout winter. So what are my hypotheses here? Well, I'm expecting that the real that my hypothesis and really the motivation behind the study and the significance of this study is that it is not the seasonal affective disorder, especially that in this day and age, so many trades and so much activity in the stock market is automated. And a lot of activity is done through a computer. Even if it's not automated, it's done through a computer so far away from the stock market. So in the United States, for example, the stock market, it's in New York City at around 41 degree latitude, excuse me, at around 42 degree latitude. But trades are happening on the West Coast, in Seattle, which is way higher up north than in New York, in San Francisco, which is way farther south than New York. So the real economic activity should be the more persistent one and more influential to the stock market. I'm also expecting that the seasonal component will be more important and will be more pronounced in countries that smooth more. And why is that? Well, if we have a lot of interest rate smoothing, so the markets expect smooth interest rates, the more jumps in the seasonality of interest rates, the more effect on the stock market. And this should be particularly pronounced in the European Monetary Union, which we're seeing, which has ever since its inception, has aggressively smooth interest rates, and thus we should see this phenomenon in the European Monetary Union. And how is that relevant to developing markets? Well, if it matters, if the interest rate smoothing does affect stock markets and adds to the stability of the stock markets, that is something that the monetary banks in developing markets can use as a tool, as a more aggressive tool for the variance in the stock market output. How do I test this? My hypotheses. Well, first, I couldn't compare my study to Kamstra and the seasonal affective disorder body of research without replicating the study itself to see if my data set yields the same results. So I replicated the study results, and I did get the same results, meaning that on the same sample, without any macroeconomic data, I was able to show that the seasonal affective disorder does affect the stock market. It's highly correlated with the stock market, and then we do see the regression results with a very strong coefficient for the seasonal affective disorder, as well as the Monday effect, where the stock market performs better on Mondays, typically, the fall effect, and the typical, and then I'll go through these results in just a moment. Later, I also interacted the key variables with seasonal interest rate autocorrelation. And lastly, I used a difference in difference study. I thought the inception of European Monetary Union and having sample of countries that are in the Monetary Union and countries that are not in the Monetary Union, but at a similar latitude, yielded themselves beautifully to the difference in difference study, comparing the effect of interest rates. Yes.
If you may quickly sum up, I mean,
what is it?
Time is a little constraint now. So if
okay,
you
sure. Yes. So I'm moving on to. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. My data is from a general, typical data sources, data stream for daily returns. I use data from International Monetary Fund, World Bank, Federal Reserve, and also National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that gathers data all over the world on climate, precipitation, cloudiness. This is data to help me control for weather variables, and that cloudiness and lack of sun. All right, so for the summary statistics, we're seeing that the return on the stock market is a daily variable is 0.026%. And the interest rates actually oscillate around 0%. However, when I decompose them, there's actually a 0.008 percent difference in interest in seasonal component of interest rates. And actually, on average, interest rates, the seasonally adjusted interest rates are below zero. I'm also using a dummy variable for fall, dummy variable for December, and I'm using the December dummy variable because we know that there is more demand for money in December during holidays around the world. I'm using a recession dummy. Because we do know, and I also am able to show that stock market obviously performs worse in recessions. Here you can see the sample of countries that I am in, including I have about 6,000 observations for Finland, Norway, Estonia, Sweden, Latvia. The countries with asterisks are the European Monetary Union countries that I'm using for my difference in difference study. I have Turkey, United States, Portugal, Malta, Cyprus, Chile, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Colombia, and Singapore. This data was robust and I was able to use it in my study. Here is the replication study, which basically confirms all the results of the seasonal affective disorder proponents, showing that my sample does in fact replicate these results. So if I add any other variables, and there will be changes to regression results, they will be significant and comparable. Here are my main results. What am I seeing in my main results? When I regress the returns on the stock markets throughout different countries in a panel regression, I do see that interest rates, so the first regression in column 2 is, well, the interest rates do have an expected negative relationship with stock market, and they are statistically significant. So I am seeing that this macroeconomic variable does make sense, does affect the stock market beyond the seasonal affective disorder. What is more, when I regress these macroeconomic variables, the seasonal affective disorder effect disappears. So in the prior studies discussing the psychological effects on the stock markets, there may have been this admitted variable bias in the form of interest rates, monetary base adjustment, industrial production, which is in fact now here insignificant, but we are seeing that also changes in foreign exchange are highly significant. So if your currency is declining, the stock market typically goes up. And that has to do, that is highly correlated with also inflation. If we have high inflation, the foreign exchange goes down, and usually a lot of times that inflation goes to the stock market. Well, I further decompose the study, my variables, and very quickly, when I decompose my variables, I see high significance of the interest rate factor on the stock market. What is more, the seasonally adjusted interest rate are important, and the relationship is as expected. But the seasonal component is very strong and has a very high magnitude and impact on the stock market whenever there is that seasonal change to the stock market. Lastly, I did a difference in difference study to see if there is any controlled, if there is any effect to comparable countries. And the variable that we care about the most is the triple interaction of time, meaning before the European Monetary Union and after the European Monetary Union, the EA treated will be the sample, the control countries, and seasonal adjustment. We see a huge impact of interest rates after the European Monetary Union has been created. So the interest rates do matter. In the study of 34 countries between 1973 and 2015, I do find a strong relationship of stock markets across countries, developed and developing countries, strong relationship between interest rates and stock markets beyond the psychological component of seasonal affective disorder. Are there any questions?
Thank you.